Hey, good evening. Good to see you, Zeldy. I'm a big fan of what you do. Keep doing it. The world needs more Zeldys to do her work, her very holy work. It's a great honor to be here, and also spend the day with the Upward team, the community, and meet some of the Rabbanim. It's been a real special day. And again, since COVID started, not enough of this, not enough just getting out and meeting different people, different communities. So really, thank you for having me. It's a tough night. You know, anytime you speak about sexual abuse, you speak about this type of suffering, which generally speaking takes place in the dark, you're revealing something that tends to not exist to the naked eye. You want to share the stories of the people who've suffered themselves. And to me, I want to start with the story of the most precious people that I know, the clients that I've worked with, who've entrusted me, entrusted others, to hold their story, and for us to know it, to reveal it, and speak about it, because everything we know about abuse happens in the dark. We want to reveal it, bring it out into the light, give it an opportunity to be seen, and also give us a chance, what the Rav said, to not be afraid of this. This is not something we need to live in fear from. We need to understand it. We need to engage it. We need to be empowered by it. But we certainly don't want to live in fear. And once we develop a language, something we're going to learn hopefully very, very soon, once we have a language for this type of behavior, we can empower our own kids to take care of themselves. We can empower us to create an environment collectively as a community to build something that's special and to build something that's safe for everybody at every stage. And to tell you the truth, the last couple of months has been really challenging in this particular arena because we're dealing with the issue. I think it's important to say it. You know, us as a community, after the whole Walder situation, we really moved backwards. And I could tell you many, many stories. I sat with a couple who literally a couple of weeks before the whole story broke, and this very, very brave woman who went through a lot in her life. She was finally building up the courage to say, I want to share my story with my family. I want to start getting the support that I deserve, that I've earned. My suffering has earned me the opportunity to be taken care of by others because that was taken away from me. And she came with her husband, this very wonderful man, supporting her, standing beside her, saying, I want to support you in this journey. And we prepared, and we spoke about the script, what she would do, how she would do it. And then the Walder situation happened, and she saw the collective communal response. She saw the letters that came out. She saw the dialogue turning into something about Lashon Hara, Motzi Shem Ra, do you keep a book, do you not keep a book? And she said, how are we talking about these simplistic things? Why is my story, my suffering, turning into a dialogue, a conversation about Lashon Hara? Now, Lashon Hara is profoundly important. We need to understand it. We need to understand the rules, the laws, and how to be sensitive to one another. But this is a story of sexual abuse. This is a story of suffering and darkness and childhood being taken away from another human being. It's not a story, it's not a moment where we talk about what we can, what we can't say. And the pain that emerged from the people who've been through this, who suffered so much, and then all around them there became the story of everything but their own story, was something that caused profound suffering. It added to the darkness. And thankfully, I could say, I think since then, we've really turned the corner as a community. There's so many opportunities where people got up together and said, what could we do to make a difference? Organizations have been started as a result of this poor reaction. And that's what we always do as a people. It's something we need to notice and reflect on, that sometimes we don't get it right the first time, but we always get it right in the end because we're a nation of people that are sensitive and careful to one another's pain. And so I want to start with the story of the people that visit my office, visit many other people's offices, and then we'll move into the conversation about how do we begin the story about prevention. Let's just start from when I was a kid. I remember there was in every school, every once in a while, they decided we're going to address this issue. And the general issue at the time, the way they supposed to address it, where there wasn't a great deal of research that was done at the time, was you're going to tell your kids that there's some creepy people in white vans, and they're really, really frightening, and sometimes they just throw candy at you. Like you're sitting on the corner waiting for a school bus, and the van pulls up, a door opens up, candies are coming in your direction, and then all of a sudden, stay away from such a person. That's the story that most of us were told. I think most of us could remember that story. And I still remember as a child hearing that story, coming home, and being terrified. I don't want to be taken away in some creepy van. And what it did is it ultimately detracted us from the honest story. The honest story of abuse is anything but a creepy person in a van. And when we talk about the statistics about it, it gets pretty dark. And we need to understand that we have these natural defenses that automatically emerge. Alice Miller, a wonderful psychologist, who actually hid that she was Jewish most of her life. It was towards the end that she acknowledged it. Her husband, after the war, made her promise that she wouldn't tell anyone that she was Jewish. But Alice Miller just made an observation where she said the darker phenomenon is, the more likely we are to need to protect ourselves from its reality. So something like this, which could be very clear in our face, we all know it's there. We all know it exists. But because it's so hard to look at, we find a way to not see it. That's simply what we do, and it's natural for us. But today we need to find a way to face it. The only way you could deal with something is by not avoiding it, by looking at it in the eyes, looking at it in the face and saying, I'm here to acknowledge you, to pay attention to you. So one thing we know, let's talk a little bit about some of the statistics. That 90% of sexual abuse victims, at least 90%, the numbers seem to go up every single year in research, they know their abuser. This abuser is not a person in a white van. It's not an outsider coming to harm us internally, but rather it's within. It's our own story. Instead of it being someone on the outside, it's now a neighbor. And even darker sometimes, and likely, sometimes it's a family member. It's someone that we trust, someone that we would generally say, I trust my child with this individual, and they could generally be alone with that person. So it automatically, and I just want to say right away, we don't need to arrive at the conclusion that because that's the reality, we now need to stop trusting people. This is not about trying to figure things out and try to identify people that are not trustworthy, but rather it's about empowering ourselves, giving ourselves a language, which unfortunately is not something that we tend to do. We tend to get fearful and then say, my kids can't go to sleepovers anymore. We can't have people sleeping over us. I need to be fearful of relatives that make their way into our home because these are people now that we know and we trust. But instead, we need to arrive at another conclusion, which is how do we empower ourselves? So 90% of victims know their abusers, so now we know it's really something that's within. And 30% of children who are abused by family members, the direct people. And again, obviously, that has a profound sense of pain when you think about it, that the people that are entrusted to provide a sense of safety in your life, these are the people who ultimately harm you the most. And imagine for a moment what it's like recovering from that. You have parents, you have uncles, you have aunts, you have teachers who provide us with a sense of safety, like a path forward. And when those people fracture us in one way or harm us in a particular way, then our ability to trust others who are supposed to be in positions of leadership becomes significantly more challenging. It's one of the reasons you're going to notice there was a study that was done by Dr. Pelkowitz and a few others where they looked at victims of sexual abuse and their later relationship to religiosity. And they found a very strong correlation. I think, as we know, correlation doesn't mean it always happens. But there was a very high correlation between people who've been sexually abused who later then struggled with a sense of religiosity. The primary reason being is that these are people entrusted to provide us with a sense of safety. And once that was fractured, how do you begin to trust in the Almighty? How do you begin to trust in the people and the guides that we have that are supposed to be leading us on the right path? And the nature of it is a little darker than we think because it's not them, it's us. It's people that we're familiar with. They're people that we understand. And in the secular literature, we don't have a lot of research that's done in the frum community. But in the secular literature, we know that generally speaking, only 40% of victims throughout the course of their lifetime will ever share that story with another person. And if that's what we're saying exists in the secular community, imagine for a moment in a community like ours where we're talking about so much shame, and so much fear of being known in a certain way, what that actually means to us. And again, the numbers mean a lot. They tell us a story. But the individual stories tell us a lot more. When you sit with a person, and hopefully you have an opportunity to one day, who's struggling in this type of way, and you listen to their pain, you listen to what they've been through, and what it's meant to them, it'll give you a perspective of how deep this pain ultimately goes. So before we talk about how the pain manifests in us and what that pain ultimately looks like and feels like, let's talk about an ideal. What does it mean to live well, to live comfortably, to live with a sense of safety in the world? What does that ultimately look like? So we know that every child is simply supposed to be unconditionally loved because they've been given to us. It's a gift. Like the Rav was saying a few minutes ago, like they're a pikadon that we're supposed to nurture and care for and love unconditionally. And we know that if you're given that as a child, you're given over the sense, and these terms and these ideologies have made their way to all our consciousness when we started talking about attachment theory and how critical that is in early development to have a sense of safety and security. If you look at all the models of development, the sense of safety that a child has well into their adult lives, the sense that they could trust the outside world, almost all of that is created during the first year of their existence, where they can't even communicate verbally. They don't have thoughts that they could later reflect back on. It is something that they simply receive. We give a gift to our children. And there are two different ways that you could look at a child. You could look at a child as, you were given to me, and I look at you and I see your soul. I look at your eyes and I see you as a distinct, separate entity than me. And it's my job to nurture you, to love you, to care for you. And when you think about what that does to a child, is that it internalizes within them. And then they become someone who's trustworthy. They become someone who could believe that there's trust in the world, and they could believe in the world around them. And there's a sense of confidence. They live with a sense of I'm okay, even though I might make mistakes and I might falter every once in a while, but the essence of me is something and someone that is largely okay. Imagine for a minute when that's not there. When you look at a child, and instead of seeing them and the beauty that they manifest, we see them as a mirror, as a reflection of ourselves, where they in that very, very early stage of life, they're treated almost like an object. They're here to serve the parent. And we all know what that looks like later on, where they have a very hard time discovering who they are. They're disoriented, largely. But we think about like a child who has that sense of self, that sense of care, where they make their way into the world with the belief that they're okay, that they're acceptable. But what happens when that's taken away? What happens when the essence of a person, which is intended to be whole, intended to be safe, for one reason or another is taken away? And the main word that we could look at is shame. That it's not, I have a shameful experience, but that I am shame. And the difference between I did something bad and I am bad could be a lifetime. One is very comfortable, where we make mistakes, and we all do. And the other one is every single moment of your life, every interaction you have, it's guided by a sense of there's something flawed in me. And that's what we're talking about, the experience of abuse at age of life where you don't have the ability to control anything. What you're left with in the end is a profound sense of shame. Now let's talk a little bit about shame. We know shame is created when you're treated like an object and not like a person. I had a few weeks ago, I was working with this woman, this young woman, and she had a profound story of abuse with an older man that took place for many, many years. And she's in treatment, going through that journey, exploring what it was like, what it meant for her. And she left a message for me one day, and then we later spoke about it in a meeting that we had, where she said, I felt so dirty that I didn't even feel worthy enough of taking a shower. I didn't even feel like I was a person who was worthy enough to clean myself. And even more than that, when we met in person, she said, even if I would clean myself, the dirt goes so deep that there's no way that any water would be able to cleanse it. Because this is a person who's not treated like an individual. They're not a person. They're treated like an object, as opposed to something that's worthy. And we know shame is created when powerlessness, a sense of you're not in control of your life, of yourself, of your destiny, is regularly held in front of them, in front of a person, so they can't escape their feeling. Or you live with a sense of powerlessness. There was a story, a moment in my life that will forever remain with me. Many, many years ago, with a good friend of mine, we ran a program called The Living Room. Living Room is many of the individuals in this program also had a history of sexual abuse. The women, I think it was around 80% of the women had a history of sexual abuse, and around 60 to 70% of the men. And they became drug addicts. And these were people who were now in recovery from drug addiction. And by the way, if we understand this shame, we could also begin to understand what addiction is all about. Addiction is not the problem. Addiction is the solution for these individuals. It's a way out. It's a way to not feel. It's a way to not confront oneself. To be living in a world where you feel a little bit more comforted, at least by a drug, by something that takes you away from yourself. So we had this group of people, very broken individuals, very fractured. Many of them came from very painful environments, and they've suffered a great deal. And there they were in the process of getting better. And we always felt like it was our responsibility to give them as much love, as much respect, as much dignity as possible. Because everyone in that program who was running it, we all knew that none of these individuals felt this way about themselves. They didn't live with a sense of dignity. So we had a Shabbaton. I grew up in Far Rockaway, beautiful town. And we had a Shabbaton, and we spent a lot of money putting up a tent and getting some really special food. Money we didn't have. We literally went door to door raising money so we could give some respect and honor to these kids who were suffering. And so imagine we had like 80 kids. These were young adults, anywhere between 17 and 22. And they're sitting in the tent Friday night. It was a beautiful evening. And all of a sudden, one of the members runs into the tent and says, "My abuser is walking up the street." And you could imagine the charge, the emotional energy that was in that room, in that tent. And literally everyone, within seconds, became infuriated and just got up, and it was like a mob mentality. They were about to kill this guy. And I just did everything I could to get ahead of them. I just wanted to warn this guy, your life is in danger. You have a group of 70 or 80 kids who are literally on their way to lynch you. And I got to the guy first, and the crowd, the bravado, the sense of like, we're going to kill this guy, was just building and building. And I went to the guy and said, "Listen, I don't know who you are. I don't know your story, but I know what this guy's saying. He's saying you hurt him, and you caused him a lot of pain. So all I'm asking is just go away, run the other direction. I don't know anything. Just get out of here so we don't have a tragedy on our hands." And the guy, being who he was, said, "No, I'm standing my ground. This is my place. I'm walking down the street, and I'm gonna get to my destination." And I said, "Okay, I warned you." I did what I had to do, and then I saw this group coming closer to him. And in that moment, when they got face to face with this man, it was one of the saddest things I've ever encountered in my life. They completely devolved. They became like kids all over again, who had no energy to fight back. They had no ability to stand up for themselves. By the time they got there, they could barely even scream at him. They could barely curse him. They could barely do anything. At some point, I was almost hoping someone would just do something. I almost wanted to push someone into him, so at least they'd walk away with a sense that we fought back. We stood up for ourselves. We had an opportunity to stand up against the person who harmed us. And all of them, one way, were harmed that way. And they couldn't do it. And I remember that night, it was one of the longest evenings, where we literally stayed up the whole night, myself and the rest of the team, and just the tears and the pain and the sorrow and the sense of, I don't have power, I can't even defend myself. I couldn't defend myself then, and I certainly can't even defend myself at this moment. And that moment, like, it brought so much awareness to me that this is not just an event that took place in the past. It's not something that happens to an individual, and then you walk away from it. It becomes you. The shame, the sense of powerlessness becomes you, and they didn't have the ability to fight back. They just simply didn't have to do that. And then shame is when a person is forced to experience something that they are not yet ready to experience. We know that developmentally, each of us are capable of experiencing different things in different stages. What we could handle as an adult is certainly very different from what we could handle as a child. And imagine, as we all know, sexuality is not something that occupies a child's mind. They don't understand it. If they have curiosity about it, it is not what we think it is. It's not a sexual sense of curiosity. It is a curiosity because they're trying to figure themselves out, their bodies, they're trying to experiment and explore. There's no malicious intent in it whatsoever. And imagine you, at that very tender age, someone harms you and introduces you to something that you can't possibly integrate, you can't possibly understand. And then it completely messes with your ability to make sense of what took place. And one of the phenomenons that we don't speak about enough is what we call the victim perpetrator, the client dealing with him right now, who unfortunately, he was abused severely by a friend's older brother for many years. And during that time, because he didn't understand what was happening to him, he couldn't integrate, he couldn't make sense of it. For him, he then went and did the same or a similar thing to someone else in his own friend group, who he now needs to deal with today as an adult, and he is dealing with it, appropriately dealing with it. But that only happens when a person is introduced to something that they can't make sense of. They simply don't understand what is happening to them. And it forms their relationship to themselves, to their bodies, to their sense of intimacy, their sense of sexuality, which, as we all know, is a beautiful, beautiful experience that's intended to bring people together. Yet over here, the way they're introduced to it is one where it's not at all about connection, it's not at all about any form of intimacy the way we understand it, but rather it is simply a physical act for them that is disorienting, and they don't understand that. So shame is created when your essence, the most private part of your being, is taken advantage of, leaving one not to trust in their whole being. It is something that touches upon the fabric of who they are. You internalize that message. That message is not one that's external to you, that I'm wonderful and I'm okay and something bad happened to me, which is ultimately what treatment is about. The first thing that we do in treatment is explore over and over and over again until somehow it's believed that you were an innocent child. You had nothing to do with this story, and someone harmed you. Someone bad did something bad to you, but your essence is good. You're still okay. But most people, it could take them years to believe that statement. They'll fight it and push it away and do everything they can to resist it because they've already internalized this idea that there's something flawed with who I am. I remember there's this one man, this one young boy, when he first got abused. He came from a horrific environment with neglect and just not a lot of care in his life. And unfortunately, this was also a part of his life. And I remember when I was treating him, sometimes as a therapist or anyone else, forget about being a therapist, but as one human being to another, that you're doing everything you possibly can to do it right. And that's what I was doing with this guy. Therapy should have been working, but it wasn't. For whatever reason, it wasn't settling, it wasn't integrating with him. It was just he kept staying in this very protective, defensive space, and I kept racking my mind, what's happening? What am I not doing right with this man? And I remember there was at some point he even said, I can't afford therapy anymore, I need to drop out. And I said, it's okay, don't worry. We'll worry about money another time, or we don't have to worry about money at all. You're in my care, and we're going to continue to work together until we somehow find a way to get better. And at some point I asked him, I brought my feelings into the room, and I said, I'm a little confused about our work. We're doing everything the way we're supposed to do it, yet there still seems to be so much distrust in this room. And I still remember his answer. Again, these moments, they just don't leave you. I have an office in a building, and another larger office opened up, which would have been a nicer space. And I remember speaking with my wife about it, saying, it would be nice to be in a larger office for my clients, for myself. It feels a little bit more respectable. I said, but I just don't feel quite ready to leave this room. The amount of vulnerability that existed in this space, it's made its way into the walls. I just can't leave it. I'm just going to stay in this office. And it's one of these moments that kind of bring that presence into the room, where I asked him, and he looked at me with these very, inquisitive eyes, and he said, I'm just waiting for you to abuse me. He goes, I don't trust at all that you're not going to hurt me. He goes, every time you do something nice, I assume, well, it's coming now. Or every time we have a good meeting, I assume, well, the next meeting something's going to happen. And the reason why he arrived at that conclusion is he literally, as a 14-year-old boy, he lived in a very insular community where he literally would wait outside at night and wait for people to harm him, literally. And he would describe that. He said, I got nothing in my house. He goes, these people, I knew they were hurting me. I knew they were harming me in a very profound way. But it was, to some degree, at least they gave me something else. Sometimes they would give me money. Sometimes they would give me other things. And he would literally wait outside for someone to pick him up. And I always ask myself when I reflect back, like, where was I? Where were we when there's a young boy at the age of 12, 13 years old who doesn't have anyone, and the only story that he has is, I'm going to wait outside for someone to harm me. And again, sexual abuse is a communal problem. It is not a single isolated event within some people, some families. We either are not healthy as a community and we're not taking care of each other in the right way, and as a result of that, things like this happen, or we do it right and we do it better and we collectively get healthier. And so there's a sense of responsibility that I live with, that we all live with, that here's one of our brothers, one of our sisters, waiting on a corner for someone to hurt him because there's no other people that are healthy in his life that could give him some sense of safety and some sense of comfort. And that's what brought him into that place. And he had no ability to ask for help, and it became a part of him. The core belief that he lived with is not something bad happened to me, or I am bad, or anything of that sort, but rather he arrives at the conclusion that I'm the problem. I'm the one who's flawed. I'm the one who there's an issue with. I'm the one who's ultimately bad as a human being. And you take that into the world. Imagine for a moment, put those lenses on for a second. What is it like? Most of us who wake up in the morning, sometimes we're happy, sometimes we're comfortable, sometimes we're anxious or depressed. Whatever it might be, we experience all these human feelings that are just universal to all of us. But what if someone wakes up in the morning and they can't even look in the mirror because they're too terrified of themselves? And I can't tell you how many clients of mine cannot look in the mirror. They can't. There's this one client that when he comes into the office, I'm on the 3rd floor of a building, and most of my clients are sent directly up to my office. And I ask, when this client comes, please call me down, because I've been working with him for a while, and he has no ability. He hasn't looked himself in a mirror in several years now. And every time we take the elevator up, which is surrounded by mirrors, we talk about it. Are we getting closer? What are we afraid of seeing in that reflection? What are we worried that is going to look back at us? And these are people that, because of the way they feel, they can't get to that place. But something we need to know, that there's a lot of healing. And this is not the end of the story. A night like tonight, and I'm sure there's always individuals in the room that have experienced a great deal of suffering. And when they look around and they see strangers, maybe familiar people who are here, come out on a cold and dark evening, and to say, I'm here to lend some support, what that does to a person provides them with a sense of self, a sense of healing, a sense of community. I'm no longer alone. And every child deserves that. Who doesn't deserve that feeling of, I'm okay, and I'm surrounded by people who are okay? And one thing we know is that all of this pain ultimately presents itself. Pain doesn't just live in silence. Pain ultimately emerges. And that's when I just want to read a line from Brene Brown, who is a wonderful, wonderful therapist who speaks a lot about vulnerability. I assume many of you are familiar with her work, where she says, a deep sense of love and belonging is an irreducible need of all people. We are biologically, cognitively, physically, and spiritually wired to love, to be loved, and to belong. When those needs are not met, we don't function as we were meant to. We break, we fall apart, we numb, we ache, we hurt others, and we get sick. This is her description. This is what happens. The cycle repeats itself until someone says, enough. I'm going to find a way to heal. I'm going to find a way to get better. I'm going to find a way to engage in a community setting where my story doesn't have to be one that is silent, where it's a story that could be heard and known. And we know that pain presents itself. I did my own research on these at-risk programs. It was really wonderful to hear that the program Upward, which I knew it many years ago as Madrigos. I know originally it sort of was designed for kids who were really struggling. They were at risk. And now it's really become a place for everybody, which sounds really wonderful. But I did some research myself. I reached out to all the directors of these programs with kids at risk. And I asked them just one question. Like, what's the percentage of your population that has a history of sexual abuse? I didn't ask about other forms of abuse. I didn't ask about other forms of suffering. Just that one question. And the lowest number I got, the lowest, was 60%. That was the lowest. The average was around 75%. With the women and with girls, it was significantly higher. It was closer to 90% than it was with the boys. We live in a community for a young woman to rebel. is a lot, or to deviate, is a lot more challenging than for a young man to deviate. They just need to have a lot more courage and a lot more strength. And we know that it's not a coincidence that this is the story. It's not a coincidence that people who are really struggling with their self and struggling with Yiddishkeit and struggling with their own sense of behavior and being, that these are individuals that are carrying a tremendous burden. And when you're carrying that burden, you need to find some relief. There's some relief. And we talk about kids who are acting out or doing things that we don't approve of, which isn't wonderful at all. But we speak like why, we ask questions in this negative form. Like what's wrong with them? Why would they do such a thing? But you understand that that's not a happy, comfortable world. When someone is responding in that type of way, they don't feel good about themselves. They're trying to find a moment of reprieve, a moment of relief. And if we knew that was the story, when we see a child struggling in that type of way, or a young adult, instead of turning our cheek and turning the other way, we'd find a way to embrace them and hug them and say, we're here with you, we love you, you're our brother, you're our sister, you're suffering. And we understand that suffering is manifesting in this type of way. Gabor Mate, a wonderful psychologist, actually he's a doctor, made his way into the world of trauma many years ago. He said, it's impossible to understand risky behavior without asking what relief the person finds or hopes to find in the risky or addictive behavior. He said, you can't understand risky behavior without trying to understand what relief the person is seeking through that behavior. And that's ultimately what it's about. It's not about having a good time. It's about trying to breathe, trying to get a moment where you feel okay. And we know that it fractures us, it separates us from our real selves, but we always need to hold on to this idea that there is a real self that's still present. And we may lose it, we may lose sight of what it is and what it looks like, and we may become alienated from ourselves. But just know that there's a way to re-encounter that. There's a way to rediscover that. And the people that have made their way through this journey, through the help of a community, through the help of caring people, through the help of these beautiful programs that exist, these people turn sometimes to be the finest of us all. The finest of people who understand what it's like to journey from a loss of self to a discovery of self. And it's not that they're discovering something that's foreign to them. They're simply reminding themselves of what they once were that was unfortunately taken from them. And they could reclaim that and become the greatest version of themselves. And they do. They do. We wouldn't have programs like we have today if not for the people that suffered. They found a way to convert that into something very unique and very special. And I can say the same for therapists as well. It happens to be that some of the best therapists out there are ones that not only understand the human condition and human suffering, but they are people themselves that have been through a lot. And as a result of that, they've taken that pain and they've turned it into something that they could use for positivity in this world. So we need to collectively make this world a better place. And the antidote to such tragedies is the opposite. Going in the opposite direction, as the Rambam says, go to the opposite extreme. If abuse happens in the dark, let's reveal it. Let's bring it out into the light. If abuse is quiet and quiets us all, shuts us all up, let's get loud. Let's have moments like this where we somehow find the strength to collectively join together and say we want to do something about this. If it disconnects us, it keeps us isolated, let us connect. Let us find a way to reach out and to not ignore the fact that people are disconnected. And let's get big, our innate power, because otherwise it makes us feel small. We become the solution, and that's something we need to know. This is not the type of experience where you say, I need to hide from myself. If anything, we need to go dig deeper into ourselves, find our compassion, find our humanity. And by doing so, we're going to discover something really, really special. And that's a little bit of the story of the people. But I want to shift a little bit into a different posture, a more of a prevention approach that we could take. And again, I really hope that we don't walk away from an evening like today with a sense of fear, with a sense of a need to grill our children on everything that they're doing. Instead, we want to create a safe home. We want to send a message to our kids that the world is a place that you could enjoy and trust, and you don't have to run away from it. But we also want to empower them with language, and we want to empower ourselves with language. And without having that, then we're really working in the dark. We need to know that. without being able to communicate effectively with our children, then they literally don't have the tools to protect themselves. The intention to protect children should literally be as natural as teaching them to call Hatzalah or 911. It's something we teach kids the earliest things. The second they learn how to use a phone, we teach them the number to Hatzalah. We teach them the number to 911. If there's a problem, here's the response. This should be similar, but we need to get comfortable. One of the main reasons why this doesn't happen is us, the adults. We have a very hard time finding the language and the courage. We all know, we've all heard this many, many times, that you need to have the talk with your kids at a certain point, whatever that age might be. We're all told that, we're all informed, have the talk. But when you look at the statistics of how many parents actually have a talk with their kids about sexuality, about their bodies, it's around 1/3 of parents actually have that conversation. And for all the men in the room, of that 1/3, 2/3 of the time, it's the mothers, not the fathers. So we don't look very good in this. And I could share my own just discomfort. I remember those, getting in the car with my boys, saying, it's time to have a talk, and they're rolling their eyes, and, how quickly can we get out of the car, how uncomfortable it is. And that's coming from someone who talks about these things all the time. The discomfort is natural, it's present, but it's something we need to find our way through. And so long as we have a particular guide, it could help us. So what I'd like to do is talk about some 5 steps of prevention. Help us develop some sense of language and what that's ultimately about. So number 1, we're learning the facts, and I'll go through each one of these. We want to minimize opportunity. Number 3, which is probably the most important, we want to talk about it. And then number 4, if we need to, recognize some of the signs that someone might be in a state of distress. And also, if that's the case, learn to respond and react responsibly. So number 1, when we talk about knowing the facts, number 1, I think it's very clear. This is very real. It very much happens in our community. They've actually found that the more insular, the more religious a community tends to be, less connected to the outside world, the more likely these events are to happen, primarily because the more insular a community is, the more shame they carry, generally speaking, with sexuality, and as a result, we don't have language. So our inability to discuss things is greater than in a community where they just don't have the same shame as we might. And it happens to our children. It happens all the time. It creates chaos, and if we respond responsibly, then we have the ability to really prevent this. There is a process. We need to know that abuse does not happen in an instant. There is something called a grooming process that some of us may be pretty familiar with. And again, I just want to say this, talking about this is a real trigger for people who've experienced elements of this. If I harm anyone, I apologize deeply. I'm just saying that in advance. But to bring a child into the inner circle of this type of darkness is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. Often, the grooming process starts months, if not years, before the actual event. There's something that I worked with perpetrators for several years, which was really, really hard work, as you could imagine, pretty sensitive guy. And working with people who are harming others on a daily basis was something that I wasn't really cut out to do. But the one message that they regularly told me, they'd look me straight in the eyes and say, we could walk into a room with kids, and without them even communicating to us, we could point out the vulnerable ones. They seem to have an ability, a very profound ability, to choose vulnerable children, people that they could say that this child likely maybe doesn't have someone to share their story with, or they feel insecure about themselves. They identify that, and they could then target a child. They have that very, very keen sense. And not only that, it often has to also include some type of access. So number 1, there's the targeting of a child, and then there's the gaining of the child's trust. This is a person that starts off often with fun, with engagement, with some sense of excitement. And especially you have to bear in mind that if you have a child that doesn't necessarily have a great deal of excitement in their life, and we know this, the poorer someone is, the lower they are in terms of IQ. In general, in communities very different than ours, they tend to be greater targets because they're already struggling with a sense of poor self-esteem, a poor sense of self. And you could gain that child's trust. It's significantly easier than someone who feels good about themselves. And they fill a need. There's a particular need that they feel that this child may or may not have in their lives, but it's something that this child may be craving. And then from there, that's when it starts moving in a very dark direction where you isolate a child, and it becomes special time, unique time. You take them out of their environment that provides some sense of safety, and then the relationship turns into something that becomes sexualized, where you introduce a child to something that is well beyond where they're at developmentally in that stage, often done with secrecy, often done with, I'm going to show you something that your friends don't even know about, and it's only between us. And then maintaining that sense of control. And you have to remember for a second, you have a child who's experiencing something that they're not yet ready to experience. And then they're also being threatened. And initially, it doesn't start with a threat. It starts with something exciting. But then being threatened that this is a story that is only between the two of us. So one thing we need to know is that this is not a fly-by-night experience most of the time, the overwhelming amount of time. This is a journey. So number one, if we're communicating, if we're talking, again, there's no 100% foolproof way to protect children from everything that could happen in their lives. We don't possess that ability. But if we're talking and we're communicating and we're asking about their day and we're asking about their relationship and we're paying attention to how they feel about themselves, we have much greater access to that child. We have much greater ability to stay in an active, protective relationship with them. And that's understanding that process. Number two, you want to minimize opportunity. More than 80% of abuse occurs in isolation, which means in order for this to take place, you need to have two people that are alone, that are isolated from everybody else. Which means that if there are people just in your house, you want to create a sense of routine, not out of fear, but with kids that are playing together, every once in a while, just make it known that you're present, that you're there. It's okay to go to the basement and just check in. Hey, you guys, how you doing? Without a sense of, going to the basement and saying, are you guys doing anything inappropriate? That's not the statement. The statement is, I'm just seeing if you guys are having a good time. It provides a sense of, I'm here, I'm protective, I'm a parent, I'm present in your life. And you just simply drop in, even if it's a trusted family member. Again, not out of fear, but out of protection. Make sure outings are observable. If not by you, then by others. When someone goes away, make sure you know where they're going. Make sure you know who they're going to, especially as children. Make sure you know who they're with. And you could ask questions. Again, it's not an inquisition. It's not like you don't want the child to feel fear, because if they do feel fear, then they start distrusting the world around them. So it's, I'm your parent. It's a sense of, I'm firm. I'm your parent. I care about your well-being. I just want to know where you are, just in case. I want to check in on you, make sure you're okay. There's no statement that I just made at this moment that mentions anything about abuse, about harm, about fear, about you need to fear anybody. This is all about, I simply want to understand and know your whereabouts. You ask the adult, again, if they're going to another child's house. You ask the adult what they're planning on doing, what's the plan for the day. Again, there's some sense of accountability. This is just being a responsible parent. It's not being a helicopter parent. It is simply being present and responsible. And then afterwards, when a child returns, you talk to them specifically about the activities, what was done, what was present. And again, to give them a sense of confidence that they could openly talk about these things. Number three tends to be the more challenging part, is we need to give children language. And we're going to go through this developmentally. What's the appropriate response of a child at a different age, and how could we begin to address them at that stage? And again, if anyone wants afterwards, I'll share all these slides with you so you have them, and you could reflect back on them later. You need to begin to communicate about safety. And again, at least initially, before a child understands sexuality, which happens in adolescence and in early adolescence, you're not introducing them to sexuality in a way that they don't yet understand. So it has nothing to do with anything beyond their simple body parts. That's all it's about, which we'll get to shortly. But you want to teach them about what parts of their bodies others should not touch, what is private, And again, there's nothing sexual in that statement. The same way you talk about walking into the street, you also talk about parts of your body being private. And thankfully, we have certain garments that we wear that make this job a little bit easier for us. Anything private is something that's covered by any form of undergarment. And again, there's nothing sexual in that statement. It is simply a statement of, this is private, this is yours. And again, training ourselves to listen more effectively, and then talking about age-appropriate development in conversation. So we're going to break this up to age-appropriate behavior from 0 to 2, what is considered appropriate so we don't overreact. 0 to 2, the common behaviors that we see during that stage, there's a lot of curiosity about one's body, including their private parts. One thing you'll notice about children is they don't have this great inhibition about their bodies. They're usually happier when they're running around free, and they don't have to worry about any garments protecting them. That's normative behavior. It doesn't say anything about them beyond the fact that they're between the ages of 0 and 2. Touching oneself, fondling oneself is normative during this stage. It is not indicative of a problem whatsoever, and there's no inhibitions around any form of nudity or being naked at all. The healthy messages that we want to introduce very early on, and one of the things that becomes really important is that the earlier we get to this type of language, the easier it becomes later. You want your 7 or 8-year-old child to say when you're giving them a shower and a bath, or that may be a little bit too old, but around that age, for them to say like, I know, Dad, I get it, this is me, you, and the doctor, that's it. You want them to understand that idea. But again, it's nothing frightening, nothing about sexuality, we'll get that soon. But you want to develop a sense of comfort with naming body parts. It's okay to name a body part. Now you could come up, and some families do this very creatively, they come up with their own unique names, and that's simply how they refer to it. They're not calling it anything specific that they feel somewhat uncomfortable about. But we have to remember that body parts and body names to a 2-year-old is not a disorienting concept. When we get older, those words they're shame-inducing. We get a little bit uncomfortable when we hear it or when we say it. But when we introduce it to a child at a very young age and it just becomes a part of our vernacular, it's not a frightening statement at all. You're just simply identifying a body part the same way you would a head or an elbow or a cheek. It is simply another part. Again, they don't attribute anything to it. But we as adults, we attribute a lot to it. So our own shame prevents us from having these open discussions with our children at a very, very young age. These are the healthy message. You want to encourage positive behavior with friends of the same age, right? Which means they're learning to communicate with the group that they're a part of. It's not extended to other groups, generally speaking. Provide simple answers about the body and its functions. Again, they don't understand anything very deep at all. We're not identifying anything beyond basic identification of body parts and a sense of comfort with that. We move on to the next stage, which gets obviously a little bit more complicated. The 3 to 6, when we call the preschool age. This is what we call normative behavior during that stage. There's occasional fondling of one's own private part, which is soothing behavior. It's not sexual. Get that call all the time from parents. My child who's 3 or 4 years old, they seem to be touching themselves when they go to sleep at night, or something like that. It is not sexual behavior, it is soothing behavior, self-soothing behavior, which by no means is indicative of a problem at that stage. Once you make your way to the older ages, then that same behavior tends to become a little bit more problematic. You have consensual and playful exploration with children of the same age. Playing doctor and playing house at this particular stage, the preschool stage, is not something to be frightened about. It's not something to shame. It's not something to say you did anything wrong. It's an opportunity to talk about private parts being private, but it's not something that you're overreacting and saying there's an actual issue in this place. This falls under the range of what we call normative behavior. It's very likely that they may ask, where do babies come from during this preschool stage? And you simply want to be very forward about it. Babies they grow in mommy's belly. That's the extent of the understanding that they need to have at that moment. Again, developmentally, they don't understand anything. And I think if you notice, and let's try to pay attention to this, when a child asks you that question, we need to pay attention to our own internal reaction, and then kind of put it aside and say, I get how I respond to this. We freak out as parents when that happens. But the child is not asking a question that elicits that type of reaction. They're simply curious. They're trying to understand the function of the body, yet we're attributing so much more to it, so it just shuts us down. And we need to find the strength to simply calm ourselves down, and sometimes we need to speak to a friend, we need to speak to a spouse, and say, just give me that strength, or stand in front of a mirror and practice saying certain words so it gets a little bit more fluid and comfortable for you. They do often express curiosity about adult bodies. They may even want to touch or follow a parent into a bathroom just sort of naturally. Again, it's another opportunity to speak about boundaries, what's yours, what's mine, what's private and what's not. Again, a lack of inhibition towards just being naked at this age. And at this point, that's when they start using slang words to describe different body parts. The healthy messages during this age, you really want to provide only very, very basic information about reproduction, like we were saying before, that babies grow in mommy's belly. That's all they need to understand and know. And very often, I think parents who have access to a lot of these ideas, they start introducing kids to these very lofty concepts well before they could even understand them. Just remember, they don't understand sexuality, at this stage. All they understand is curiosity of the body. You want to encourage basic understanding of privacy, appropriate and inappropriate touch. Again, the greatest analogy that we have is bathing suits and parents and doctors. Anything that a bathing suit covers for a boy or a girl is considered private, and that is for self, parent, and doctor, and anything else is more playful activity. And the earlier we get to this type of language, the more empowered a child could become in learning to identify, what is mine and what is others. Let's skip a little bit to middle adulthood, where, again, this is where, early adolescence, 7 to 12, late childhood, the beginning of early adolescence, this is when we start needing to have a little bit more honest conversations with our children. This is when they make their way into the world of understanding things. And we always need to go back to that question and that statement. If we go around the room and ask everybody here, at what age did you become familiar with sexuality? Usually it takes place during this era, the 7 to 12. But most of us get terrified by that idea, and we need to ask ourselves a question: who would we rather our child to get some of these messages from? Because they're going to get it. I still remember when I got my introduction to these types of ideas, and it was by some kid in my class who had no filter, and most of the information didn't even make sense. It elicited a great deal of curiosity, but there was no adult having that conversation with me. So a child, by the time they reach adolescence or early adolescence, they are going to become familiar with these ideas. We live in a world where these ideas are one way or another communicated. And every kid has a kid in his class who has more exposure than your kid. That's simply just the laws of the world. So if that's the case, and we know that going in, we have the opportunity to ask ourselves that very important question: who would I rather my child hear these messages from, me or from somebody else? And that's where having the talk comes from. At this point, you need greater transparency with development and also personal empowerment. This is when they begin to make their way into that world. There are a few books that are in these slides that you can see at the end. These are books that were written by frum people for the frum community on how to have these conversations. Because again, naturally, it's really hard to do it. When we're just relying on our own intuition, we get all caught up. And that is even with people who've explored this and studied this. We simply have our own internal defenses against all this stuff. And now that's a little bit of the prevention, a few more steps. Number 4 is recognizing the signs. This is when, let's say, God forbid, something happens. And we need to understand that there's going to be a reaction, one way or another. Recognizing the signs. And I do want to say in advance that there's, for parents in the room who've needed to endure this with a child, the amount of beating oneself up, the amount of just self-doubt that it elicits. And again, most of the time we don't know. We don't know. And we don't have the ability to know things that we don't know. And we need to do our best, and we need to show up, And we need to have very, very meaningful conversations with our children if they do come forward and say that, I'm sorry, I missed something. I really do. I was trying to pay attention. But if we were paying attention and we were doing what we could to protect our children, it's a very easy conversation to have. Obviously, it's brutal and it's filled with a lot of pain, but it's a lot easier where you could say, I really did everything I knew what to do. It was available to me. But if we didn't do anything, that conversation is filled with rage. I was meeting with a parent recently who had a child who unfortunately went through some terrible experiences in this area. And she kept saying that, why is my child madder at me than she is at even her own perpetrator? She has so much rage towards me. And we kept talking about the fact that a parent is responsible to protect their children. And then the mother kept going back in her head, and she kept really beating herself up over this story. And hopefully we could learn something from this story. Her child, they grew up in a very, very frum community where you're not allowed to talk about anything. But her child came to her several times at the age of like 9 or 10 and said, like, Ma, what is sex? That was the question that this child asked the mother. And instead of like pausing for a second and asking herself the question, like, why is my child asking me this question? She shamed the child. She quieted the child. And when the child had an opportunity to tell the mother, like, that's the reason why I have so much rage towards you, is I tried communicating with you. I tried telling you I was in distress, but you weren't listening. You were governed by some other ideas and not listening to me, which was something that this parent still lives with. She still needs to carry that, even though they're working on healing their relationship. So some of the things, obviously, these are very universal. They're not specific to any child, but they're basically symptoms of children in distress. Some significant unexplained changes at home or school. You have a child who's doing well, and all of a sudden they start falling off the map academically. School performance decreasing, lack of ability to concentrate, depression, hopelessness, anxiety. Cutting is very familiar in early adolescence. New fears. Fears that begin to emerge, a child that you knew to be pretty trusting of people, all of a sudden they're saturated with fears. Now again, these are very general. These don't mean that this is the story. These are just classic signs of a person in distress. And a child doesn't know how to communicate verbally and let you know that they're struggling. So instead, they act out behaviorally. And those are things we need to pay attention to, but we need to know that all of these things could also be indicative of other things as well. They simply represent distress. Sleep difficulties, fear of going to bed alone or can't fall asleep, avoiding specific people, situations, and activities. I remember there was this family I was working with where they prosecuted the perpetrator. And I remember I was there with the family behind a one-way mirror, and it was me and the parents, and the prosecutor was questioning the children. And the prosecutor asked the question to the child and said, did you ever tell your mother or your father that you were having a hard time, that something happened to you? And both the girls said, yeah, they just shook their head, yes. And I remember sitting there with the parents, and they looked at me with these eyes like, never a word, nothing. And then when the kids came out, it was very important for them not to like jump on the kids and try to figure it out right away. But over time, they asked them that question, and both the kids responded the same way, where they said, we kept telling you that we didn't like the piano teacher. That was the only thing they knew how to say at the time. That's all they could say. But when someone avoids something, when someone has a reaction to something that doesn't quite make sense, it's something that you're giving them that's positive and good and they should be enjoying. And their reaction is very, very different to that. Again, it doesn't mean this is the story. It just means pay attention. Ask another question. Follow it up with something else. Why don't you like the piano teacher? But these parents, they had a real need for their kids to play piano. That's the truth. It wasn't something they were really open to hearing, that their children wouldn't like piano. So they weren't really listening. It was their own internal block. They couldn't really hear their children. Either extreme modesty or promiscuous behavior is also one of the reactions that's specific to sexual abuse. And physical symptoms, which is headaches and primarily abdominal pains. what we call fictitious pain, where it's not you go from doctor to doctor to doctor, they find nothing wrong with the person, but they still continue to complain about it. Eating problems, anorexia and bulimia tend to be fairly common reactions to sexual abuse, and primarily especially with boys, but certainly with girls as well, with what we call enuresis or encopresis, which is bedwetting or soiling themselves in sleep. Very, very, very common. In children, that's almost like their body's reaction, their way of responding to the distress. And then number 5, we want to react responsibly. If it is the case, and there is something, we don't want to overreact. We don't want to elicit more fear, more shame, more pressure, more guilt. We don't want them to shut down and pull away. We want to create an environment that is safe for them to emerge. And believe the child. It's some of the saddest questions that come, and anyone who's doing this work that come their way, is like, how do you know to believe someone? And then, yes, obviously there's rare, very rare cases. When I say rare, I'm talking about, generally speaking, the research indicates 1%. That's how rare. 1% is almost non-existent of cases where people make this stuff up about others. This is not the type of behavior that people simply make up. The only time that it's found to be the case, if one person accuses multiple people at the same time, they have found that situation you got to pay a little bit of attention to. But generally speaking, a child coming forth, or even an adult coming forth, the chances of this not being the case in their lives is virtually non-existent. So we need to believe. We simply need to believe. And it's hard to believe because we have our own internal resistance to believing that such a phenomenon could exist in the world. But we simply need to go beyond ourselves and believe. We want to thank the child for telling us and praise them for their courage, for coming forth, and be very careful not to go into great detail. One thing we need to know at a very impressionable age as a parent, when we're not trained to do this, by asking certain guided questions, we could actually create memories that may or may not have been real, that could possibly be dealing with later on. So all we want to do is validate, encourage, let them know how proud we are of them, and give them support in their strength for sharing that story. After that, the next call is to some form of professional help or agency that deals with this so you can get the proper guidance. You don't want to ask too many especially guided questions to a child when you don't understand the landscape of how this affects people and what it really means to them. So make sure you get them to the right place. Obviously, when we need to, and very often we do, because perpetrators often continue their behavior until they're stopped. And unfortunately, we had this meeting today with the Rabbanim in the community. How do we really put an end to this? And the only way that we really do is by responding appropriately, by responding actively, and not trying to move people around and shift them to other communities because they're simply going to harm somebody else. Very often we need to take action, we need to report, very often we need to bring the law into the picture in order to protect other children. But most importantly, we don't panic. We want to give them a sense of safety and security and let them know that we're there with them. I want to give a few books that I would recommend. There's a wonderful book that was put out, I think by, maybe it's Torah Masora, I'm not sure, but it's called Let's Stay Safe. And it's a book that's a children's book that really does a lot of this work that we just spoke about for you. It's written about safety general, so it speaks about Hatzalah, and it speaks about water, and it speaks about other forms of danger, and it also speaks about protecting your body and what privacy means, and you can read that book with your children. There's another book called My Body Belongs to Me, which is also a fabulous book, and it's a secular book, and another secular book called Some Parts Are Not for Sharing, which again, these are books that are written really, really well, and they give us that language that we need to read it with a child. And again, as we make our way into the early adolescence where the conversation gets more complicated, there are 2 other books I'd recommend. One called Talking to Your Children About Intimacy, which is a guide for Orthodox Jewish parents by Sarah Dement. And another one this is a little bit more advanced, talking about intimacy, sexuality by Yocheved Debo. So these are books that were really introduced to our community, Give Us Language. And again, I want to express my gratitude for all of you to come out, to be here, to support, to learn, to empower, and to give each other strength. And again, there's a lot of darkness in this conversation. But when I see people taking their time to support one another, that's what brings light into this space. So thank you for being a part of the solution. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you.